Implicit grid. This is probably one of the most important lessons in this entire course. Implicit grid. I feel like this is almost like the inner formula for making interface design work. And what I mean by implicit grid is it's like a soft grid. So what I do is I take a number, in my case 4 pixels, and I use that as like the baseline grid measurement for everything in the entire app. So 4 pixels or 8 pixels or 12 or 16 or 20 and so on and so forth in multiples of 4. And I use this I would say 90% in kind of like a rigid context. Now there are times where I might use a 10 pixel margin or padding, but I don't think of that as breaking the grid. I just think of it as like a 2.5 version of the 4 pixels. So 4 times 2.5. So I'm using 2.5, almost like a half grid when I'm spacing it. And so I use this implicit grid for not even almost, every single element on the page, whether it's 120 pixels or 4 pixels or 12, just everything has a relation. And the implicit grid really just, it is nothing more than negative space. It refers to the negative space between objects. And I have been using this for a very long time, and it's like the glue that holds everything together. So let's take a look at these examples of the implicit grid in action. Okay, so first of all, I have a very zoomed in view of the contrast app that I've been using here. So this contrast app that helps you pick different color contrasts and know if they are failing or passing. You can see right here in between all of these elements are multiples of 4. And I can kind of describe why I chose each one of these measurements. So first of all, these two elements are very closely related. You're choosing a foreground color and you're choosing a background color. So I wanted these elements to be really close together, so I chose 4 pixels of spacing between those two elements. And this little switcher in the middle, it is pretty closely related to switching the colors, but it's not the exact same thing as switching as the actual color. So this is not related to the color as much as the picker is related to the input field. So that's why I chose 8 pixels to spread that out a little bit more, because they're not quite as closely related. And you might think, 4 pixels and 8 pixels, does that really matter? And the answer is yes, it matters a lot, because all of these little tiny decisions across all of the little elements are what are going to give your interface that clean feel, and it's going to feel right. So if you look back at this version of the app, it might be hard to put your finger on why this has a nice clean balance, but I believe, it's the type size and it's the spacing between everything. And it's not just some arbitrary number, it's an intentional number. So if I look over here, you have your score. So this is not as related to selecting a color or switching the color, and it's more of like a standalone result. So I wanted it to have a lot more of space. So I'm using 16 pixels here. And the reason I'm not using 16 pixels on the other side is because a lot of time, and in fact, the majority of the time, you're not going to have such a super high contrast like that. A lot of times you're trying to test colors that are barely passing, and you're trying to find just the right amount of contrast. And when you're doing that, your numbers are actually going to be in the single digits. So it just got 7.64, or 3 digits versus 4 digits. And I wanted to point out the fact that most of the time we're going to have a 3-digit number there, and that's going to make it look a little bit more like 16 pixels. And I didn't want the app to be stretchy based on the result, so I'm making a little bit of a trade-off right there. So that's why there's 12 on the right side versus 16 on the left. And then with the settings icon, I just wanted it to be even, an even amount, so 12 on each side here. And then looking back on the left, I wanted the same amount of space between the actual score, A, AAA, AA large, things like that, and the result there. So there's multiple versions. You can have double A, you can have double A large, or triple A. And triple A is the widest version of the score. So I use that as the maximum width, knowing that if I only have a double A score, that is obviously not going to be 16 pixels. But that's fine. I just wanted to use the maximum to make sure that you could see, okay, 16 here, 16 here. It's just kind of a good rule of thumb. And the reason I use 20 on this side is because when the app is pulled off of the menu bar, we need to bring in this little X to close it out. And having 20 pixels versus 16 gave it just enough room to where it wasn't really crowded around the top of this A right here. And also, I think the extra negative space on the left, it kind of helps give this score a little bit more prominence, because that score is actually what is most important on this entire app. So that's a breakdown for this tiny little app in terms of how I use the 4-pixel grid, or yeah, the 4-pixel implicit grid. But I want to go to the symbols page and zoom out here and go to this one. So we have all of our spacing between all the elements, but then inside of those tiny little elements, if you click on this text field, and it's a little bit hard to see with that orange. Let me actually change the color of that. Okay, where's the background color? Let's just change that to like green or something. Okay, so if I click on the input text and, oh, I'm sorry, this is a symbol, that's why it wasn't showing the rulers. So if I click into that input field, you can see if I hold Option and I look at the measurements around even the input field, I'm using 4 pixels of padding on top and 8 pixels on the left and right. And a lot of times I use most of the time your buttons and your input fields, it's going to need a little bit more of padding on the left and right than it is on the top, because it's just kind of the way the balance feels. So if this was a little bit tight all the way around, it might feel a little bit too crammed. So a lot of times your left and right padding is going to need to be a little bit more than your top and bottom. But even at this detail, I'm using this implicit grid system to say, okay, 4 on the top, 4 on the bottom, left and right. Sometimes if I'm using a bigger version, I might do 16 pixels on the top and maybe 24 on the sides, something like that. And you can play around with it, but using that 4-pixel grid is just a really good system to kind of think, okay, how is all this going to fit together? Some people like using an 8-pixel grid and not going below 4, but for me, I feel like 4 pixels gives me greater flexibility. And the reason I don't use 5 or 7 or some kind of arbitrary number like that is because 4 even numbers can always be divided by 2, and it's especially helpful if you're going from 1x to 2x or 3x. So 4 becomes 8 or 4 becomes 12, depending on 1, 2, or 3x if you're kind of worried about that. So in another example, we're looking at this business hour screen on this app, and I've shown this before, but it's just another version of the implicit grid in action. All right, so you can see here on this line item, I've got 20 points of spacing here, or 20 pixels. So that's just 5 increments of 4. Whereas the top and the bottom, right now, this is 14 and 15. But what I've really done here is I've decided that I want all of my tappable line items to be 48 pixels tall. And then I'm just going to center align this content inside of here. So that starts to somewhat break the implicit grid, but not that much, because it really depends on what your line height is. Because I could easily adjust this line height to make it end up being 16 by 16. So if I have a 16 point font and the line height is set at 1, that's going to be an even amount. So with the type size inside of an actual border, it's going to be based on the line height in terms of how big that text box is. But sometimes if you have, your line wrapping into a 2-line kind of a thing, you're going to want more than 1 points of line height. So that might affect the way the 4-pixel implicit grid is added to, those internal elements. But it's not that big of a deal. Most of what I'm worried about here is the left and the right. And over here on the right, I'm also using 20. And then I'm also making a decision to do 24 on the right and 24 on the left. So that's kind of the main focus of the margin and the padding on this particular app. And in most mobile apps and all the little details, coming up with the left and right margin for the cells, and then the left and right margin and padding inside of those cells are going to be key for kind of establishing that system. And then I'm going to use the implicit grid also to say, okay, all of these elements in between here, if they're closely related, I'm actually using 6 pixels here, which is kind of like 1.5 of an implicit grid of 4. And if it is related but a different section, I'm using 24 pixels as the rule for spacing out things that are not related. So all of these are related because you can choose between these 3 things. But this time zone is a slightly different category and a slightly different piece of interface on the screen. So I'm using 24 as the rule to divide that content. Instead of using a line or instead of using some other technique, I'm saying that 24 pixels is the rule for separating that type of content. And that way, now if I want to go down here and add another third section, 24 pixels again is the rule. So I don't have to worry about some crazy baseline grid or a bunch of very specific rows and columns. So the content can grow as long as it needs to grow. And I'm saying, okay, for everyone that's closely related, I'm going to use 4 or 6 pixels. You get to decide that, change it to 4, 6, 8, see what looks the best, and then kind of lock in that implicit rule set for that particular screen. And this is also going to make it easier for developers to put this into practice, because you can even tell them, say, I'm using a 4-pixel grid for this. So like all of these elements are, based on that. It's either, 24 on the side or 36 in between, 32, whatever it is. You can kind of more easily communicate the system that you're using to design and space everything out with. Even inside of this little component here, you can see I've got this little speaker icon, and it's 18 pixels from the side. It probably should have been 16. That might have gotten bumped over. So I'm going 20 on the top and bottom, 16 on the side. And then over here, you can see that the play icon, I'm going 22 from the side. That could have been 18 or 24. I think because this one was 18, I think this stuff might have got bumped over a little bit. So I'd usually want to go even on both sides. So if these are 20, then I would probably want to do 20 there and grab this speaker, make sure that's 20. And then we've got our slider. There we go. So that might have gotten shifted a little bit. So now we've got 20 on the left, top and bottom, 20 to the right. Same thing here, 20, 20, 20, and then 20 to the left there. And so that just kind of gives it a nice clean feel. The negative space is going to be the same all the way around, and it's just going to keep that consistent feeling. So inside of each cell has its own little implicit grid rules, and then go out one layer, and then you have another set of implicit grid rules. So I'm using the same 6 pixels here to kind of, I'm saying anything that's 6 pixels is a little more closely related, and anything that is, in the same ballpark, but needs to be spaced out a little bit more is going to be 24. So I'm establishing those rules as I'm exploring and designing, and I'm thinking about it. And just having that 4-pixel grid just kind of makes it a little bit easier of a system to rely on. And I'm using 24 on the sides for all of these. And here it is in Adobe XD. I created these designs for an Adobe XD workshop I did at Adobe Max. But I just want to point out that, you know, all of these look a lot. These are very different looking apps. From the contrast app to these business hours here that you're looking at on this phone app, and now in this random. This is kind of like a time traveling concept app. It was just some designs for just a kind of a presentation. But you can look in here. If I click this president name, and I'm measuring from the avatar edge, you can see that it's 24 pixels. And the space between the date, the time, and the year, that's going to be 8 pixels. And the space between the avatar and the left edge of the screen is 16 pixels. Same way from this thing. I've got the title here, 16 pixels from the left edge there. And it's just an easy way to kind of make sure that all of your stuff is nice and even and it's spaced properly. And so it's just kind of the underlying rule that I use for every single design that I've ever done when I first, after I learned about the implicit grid. So this is a iOS app called Roadie that I designed. This is quite a long time ago, but you can see in here, even on this one, this one is 30 pixels from the avatar and the image. The image is 20 from over here. And of course, some things are going to get knocked out of place. It's not always going to be exactly perfect, but it is just a very good unit of measurement, especially for something like this. So I've got my title, which needs a little bit more room. And since this stuff right here doesn't need to be all up on that information because it's slightly different. So I can use my 4 or 8 pixel rule to kind of separate it as necessary. So this is 20 pixels from the avatar, and this avatar is 30. And then the same thing where I'm using these as rules kind of throughout the entire app. And I'm just bringing up a lot of different examples because I want to point out that all of your apps can look completely different, but you can still use that same 4-pixel grid rule for your tiny details and your spacing. And we're going to go way back to 2012 or so, and this is when I was still using Photoshop to design apps. This is actually a mobile website that was created for Wells Fargo. And if I scroll in here and I choose this, you can see that even these, okay, this is probably supposed to be 40, but I'm using this implicit grid on this. So these titles are 40 pixels from the top. This text right here should be 16 pixels from the title. And this icon here, let's click this icon. And these are, I guess that's 48. Some of this has definitely gotten shifted. So the title from the icon, it's a little bit harder to do the measurements in Photoshop. So title from icon, the spacing there is 48 pixels. And then the icon from the edge is 44. It's very likely that I might not have been as good at using the grid back then. But I just want to point out, I'm using this grid all the time, and I've been using it for a very long time, and it is definitely the secret sauce for making sure the interface components are nice and aligned. Even on this Streamline website. So if you look at all of these little containers and a lot of this stuff, I'm using the implicit grid even on this stuff, like inside the spy icon, even for the margins inside of here, even the way that I'm kind of deciding to make these CTAs, these call to actions, all of the little details inside of here, I'm using the implicit grid to space all of this out Now I do have, an explicit grid that's saying, okay, I want this left line here, and then I want this to take up more of space. So I am using that larger grid to set out some bigger content, but probably more important than that is going to be the implicit grid that I'm using to design everything else inside of there. So if you look at the actual design file, you can see if you go into this buy button, I've got 4 pixels on top and bottom, 8 pixels on left and right, which is exactly the same as some of those line items in the phone, the app with the phone settings. And if you scroll down here, you can see that these titles on top of these modules, there's 8 pixels of spacing between the two. Sometimes 4 pixels might look like too small of an amount, but the 8 pixels ended up looking pretty nice. And it just gives you an easy way to kind of just to cycle through your options. You're not just kind of moving stuff around randomly, hoping that it looks good. You have a very systematic approach to laying out all the little pieces. So even these icons, they're 80 pixels from the top and the bottom, or 80 pixels from the left edge and the top edge. And then they're spaced out, it looks like 88 pixels in between. And those are all divisible by 4. It's an easy way to just create this system that you can rely on and use in just about every situation, whether it's really big or even really small. Okay, for homework for the implicit grid, I want you to design either an app for like an audiobook layout that has a title with a status bar, maybe a profile icon and an avatar. You can actually use audible.com screenshots if you want. Just look up their app. Or I'll post some of the screenshots I'll post some of these screenshots down below that you can use as reference. Or you can use the table of contents that you used in one of the other lessons and apply a title and a tab bar and maybe a detail screen or something like that. But the big thing to do is design one of these screens and just obsess over 4 pixels, 8 pixels, 12, 16, and kind of get that rhythm of using that system while you're laying out those little tiny details. If you don't want to do the Audible app, also another good option would be to do the settings app on either the iPhone or Android and just pick any of these screens. You could do the main screen, or you could do one of these internal screens. And you don't have to copy it exactly, but you could try to get really close and try to put on your implicit grid of 4 pixels, just something that is more interesting to you. But what the main thing that I want you to do is I want you to really embrace this idea of making every tiny little detail be a part of that 4 pixel implicit grid, because this is going to be the key to giving all of your little details. It's just going to make it breathe, make it come to life, and make it be clean and readable. So get started on this homework. Again, pick out whichever one you want to do and post it into Slack and let me know, if you found it easy or hard to work with this grid. But I assure you, if you can adopt this mindset of using this implicit grid, it's going to make your life so much easier. So I can't wait to see what you come up with, and I'm going to let you get started.